The gate slammed shut behind them. Sarah froze, panic rising in her chest. The survey markers had vanished overnight, and now her property line had been redrawn without her consent. As the HOA president approached, a smug grin plastered across his face. Sarah knew her American dream was about to become a living nightmare. Sarah gripped the fence, her knuckles turning white. This has to be some kind of mistake. You can't just move my property line without my approval. The HOA president, Gregory, folded his arms. I'm afraid there's been a miscalculation, Sarah. The survey shows your fence encroaching on common ground. It has to go. The hell it does. Sarah snapped. I've lived here for 15 years. That fence is on my land. Gregory tisked, shaking his head. I'm sorry, but the numbers don't lie. You're in violation of our community bylaws. If you don't remove the fence by the end of the week, we'll have no choice but to fine you. Sarah's heart raced. This couldn't be happening. She and her husband, Mark, had poured their life savings into this house. The thought of losing it all over a few feet of property made her sick to her stomach. You can't do this, she pleaded. There has to be some way to fix this. Please, let me see the survey. Gregory held up a hand. I'm afraid that's not possible. The decision has been made, and it's final. I suggest you start making arrangements to relocate that fence. As he turned to leave, Sarah grabbed his arm. You're making a huge mistake. I'm not going to roll over and let you steal my property. Gregory glared at her, yanking his arm free. I'd be careful if I were you, Sarah. You don't want to make this any harder than it has to be. With that, he stalked off, leaving Sarah trembling with anger and fear. She had to find a way to fight this, no matter what it took. Mark came rushing out of the house, his face etched with concern. What happened? I heard yelling. Are you okay? Sarah quickly filled him in, watching as his expression shifted from confusion to outrage. Those bastards can't do this, he growled. This is our home, our land. We're not going to let them take it without a fight. I know, Sarah said, her voice quivering. But what if they're right? What if the survey shows the fence is on their property? Mark pulled her into a tight embrace. Then we'll get our own survey done. There's no way they can just change the lines without our consent. We're going to get to the bottom of this, I promise. Sarah nodded, drawing strength from her husband's unwavering support. Together, they would take on the HOA and the mysterious survey team that had turned their lives upside down. This was their home, and they weren't going down without a fight. Sarah paced the living room, her mind racing with possibilities. How could the HOA simply redraw her property lines without any warning or justification? It didn't make sense. There has to be something we're missing, she muttered, chewing on her lip. Mark watched her from the couch, his brow furrowed in thought. I'll call the title company first thing in the morning, see if they have any records of a recent survey. Maybe we can get a copy and have our own expert take a look. Sarah nodded, pausing to meet his gaze. And what if they're right? What if the fence really is on their land? Then we'll move the fence, Mark said firmly. But we're not going to do it because some shady HOA president tells us to. We'll do it on our terms, when we're good and ready. Sarah couldn't help but admire his resolve. Mark was always the level-headed one, the one who kept her grounded when her emotions threatened to boil over. She took a deep breath, trying to match his composure. Okay, let's start there. In the meantime, I think I'm going to pay a visit to the HOA office tomorrow. See if I can't dig up some more information on this so-called survey. Mark nodded, reaching out to give her hand a gentle squeeze. I'm with you, every step of the way. We're going to get to the bottom of this, I promise. Sarah managed a weak smile, squeezing his hand in return. I know. I just hope we can figure it out before they start finding us or. She shuddered, unable to finish the thought. The idea of losing their home, their sanctuary, was almost too much to bear. This was where they had built their lives, where they had dreamed of starting a family. And now some power-hungry HOA was trying to rip it all away. Sarah clenched her jaw, her determination hardening. They're not going to win. I won't let them. With a newfound sense of purpose, she began to formulate a plan. Tomorrow, she would march into that HOA office and demand answers. And if they didn't like it, well, she was more than ready to take this fight to the next level. The following morning, Sarah marched into the HOA office, her shoulders squared and her chin held high. Gregory, the smug HOA president, looked up from his desk, his expression shifting to one of barely concealed annoyance. Sarah, what a surprise. To what do I owe this? Pleasure. Sarah didn't waste any time with pleasantries. I want to see the survey that shows my fence is on your property. And I want to see it now. Gregory leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. I'm afraid that's not possible. The survey is private property of the HOA. We don't just hand it out to anyone who demands to see it. Sarah slammed her palms on his desk, the sound echoing for the emptied office. This is my property we're talking about. You can't just redraw the lines without my consent. I have a right to see that survey. Gregory's eyes narrowed. And I'm telling you, that's not going to happen. The decision has been made, and it's final. If you don't remove that fence by the end of the week, we'll be forced to take legal action. Sarah felt her blood boiling. Legal action? You mean like putting a lion on my house? Fining me until I'm penniless? She shook her head, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Well, aren't you just a regular knight in shining armor? Gregory's lips curled into a thin smile. I'm simply enforcing the rules of this community, Sarah. Rules that you agreed to when you bought this house. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with your lawyer. Sarah opened her mouth to retort, but a soft knock at the door interrupted her. A young woman with a worried expression poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you, Mr. Gregory. He says it's urgent. Gregory's jaw tightened, and he shot Sarah a warning glare. Excuse me for a moment. As he stepped out, Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this was her chance to get a closer look at the elusive survey. Glancing around quickly, she moved to the desk, rifling through the papers until she found what she was looking for. But just as her fingers grazed the edges of the file, a voice boomed behind her. What do you think you're doing? Sarah whirled around to find Gregory and a tall, imposing man in a suit glaring at her. I was just looking for the survey, she stammered, her heart racing. The man in the suit stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. That survey is property of the HOA. I suggest you step away from the desk, ma'am. Sarah felt a surge of panic, realizing she had just made a grave mistake. As the two men advanced on her, she knew she was in serious trouble. Sarah's mind raced as she backed away from the desk, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The man in the suit approached her, his expression stern. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately. Attempting to access private HOA documents is a serious offense. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. I was just trying to understand what's happening to my property. You can't just change the lines without. That's enough, the man interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. You're trespassing on private property and interfering with an ongoing investigation. I suggest you leave before I'm forced to call the authorities. Sarah glanced at Gregory, who stood by with a smug grin plastered across his face. It was clear he had called in reinforcements to shut her down. This isn't over, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. I'm going to get to the bottom of this, no matter what it takes. The man in the suit stiffly gestured towards the door. I'm afraid it is over, at least for today. Now, I suggest you leave before I have you removed. Swallowing her pride, Sarah turned and headed for the exit, her mind racing with a million questions. Who was this mysterious man, and what was his connection to the HOA? What were they trying to hide? As she stepped out into the bright sunlight, Sarah felt a renewed sense of determination. She may have lost this round, but she was more convinced than ever that something sinister was at play. And she was going to get to the bottom of it, even if it meant going to war with the entire HOA. Back at home, Mark was waiting anxiously. When Sarah recounted the confrontation, his expression darkened. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said, his voice low and intense. "But we're not going to let them get away with this." He pulled her into a tight embrace, and Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for her unwavering partner. With him by her side, she knew she could take on the HOA and their shadowy allies. "I'm going to call the police," Mark said, his jaw set with determination. "If they're conducting some kind of illegal investigation, they need to be held accountable." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing ahead to their next move. "And I'm going to reach out to the media. If we can't get answers through official channels, maybe we can shame them into giving us the truth." As they set their plan in motion, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were up against something much bigger than a simple property dispute. The HOA's actions were growing increasingly erratic and hostile, and she couldn't help but wonder what they were trying to hide. One thing was certain. She and Mark were not going to back down without a fight. The sun had barely risen when Sarah and Mark arrived at the local police station, determined to file a report about the HOA's suspicious behavior. The officer behind the desk listened intently as they described the confrontation at the HOA office, his brow furrowing with concern. "So you're saying the HOA is conducting some kind of secret investigation, and they won't let you see the survey that's redrawing your property lines?" he asked, his pen poised over the incident report. Sarah nodded emphatically. "Exactly. And when I tried to look at the file, they threatened to have me arrested for trespassing." The officer let out a low whistle. "That's a pretty serious accusation. Do you have any evidence to back it up?" "Just our word against theirs," Mark admitted, "but we know something shady is going on. They're trying to intimidate us and force us off our own land." The officer frowned, drumming his fingers on the desk. "I see. Well, I'll make sure this gets passed along to the detective division. They can look into potential abuse of power or unlawful business practices by the HOA." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. "So you'll investigate?" "That's great. Thank you." The officer held up a hand. "I can't make any promises, ma'am. This is a civil matter, and the police may not have jurisdiction, but we'll do what we can to look into it." As they left the station, Sarah could see the worry etched on Mark's face. "Do you really think the cops are going to do anything?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt. Sarah sighed, squeezing his hand. "I don't know, but it's worth a shot. We have to try every avenue we can to fight this." Their next stop was the local newspaper office, where they pleaded their case to an investigative reporter named Carla. She listened intently, her eyes widening as they described the HOA's increasingly aggressive tactics. "This sounds like a textbook case of abuse of power," Carla said, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she took notes. "If what you're saying is true, the HOA could be in serious trouble." Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest. "We just want the truth, Carla. Can you help us expose what they're trying to hide?" Carla's lips curved into a determined smile. "You bet I can. This is the kind of story I live for. Just give me a day or two to dig into it, and I'll see what I can uncover." As they left the newspaper office, Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope. If the police and the media were on their side, maybe they had a chance of taking down the HOA and reclaiming their property. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The HOA was clearly willing to go to great lengths to protect their secrets, and Sarah knew she and Mark were in for the fight of their lives. 2 days later, Sarah and Mark sat anxiously in Carla's office, their hearts pounding as she laid out her findings. "Okay, so I've been digging into this HOA mystery, and let me tell you, it's a doozy." Carla leaned back in her chair, her expression serious. "First of all, the survey that supposedly shows your fence is on HOA property. It's completely bogus. Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with confusion. Bogus? What do you mean? Carla grabbed a stack of papers from her desk, flipping through them. I managed to get my hands on a copy of the original survey from when you bought the house. It clearly shows your fence is on your property. The new survey the HOA is using is a forgery. Mark's eyes widened. So they're just making this up, trying to steal our land? Carla nodded grimly. It gets worse. I also discovered that the survey team the HOA hired is a front for a larger organization, one with ties to some shady real estate developers in the area. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You mean, they're trying to seize our property for some kind of development project? Bingo. Carla leaned forward, her expression grim. It looks like the HOA is in cahoots with these developers, using underhanded tactics to force homeowners off their land. And they're willing to go to great lengths to cover their tracks. Mark shook his head in disbelief. That's insane. How is that even legal? Carla sighed. Unfortunately, it's not technically illegal, at least, not yet. The HOA is technically within their rights to enforce community bylaws, even if they're using questionable methods. But I've contacted the local authorities, and they're looking into potential fraud and abuse of power charges. Sarah felt a surge of relief and determination. So what do we do now? Carla leaned back in her chair, a glint of mischief in her eyes. Well, I've got a plan, and it involves giving the HOA a taste of their own medicine. As Carla laid out her strategy, Sarah and Mark listened intently, their expressions shifting from disbelief to grim determination. They were no longer just fighting to save their home, they were fighting to expose a web of corruption that stretched far beyond their neighborhood. And with Carla on their side, they felt more confident than ever that they could take down the HOA and its shadowy allies, once and for all. The next day, Sarah and Mark gathered at the local park with Carla, finalizing the details of their plan to expose the HOA's shady dealings. Okay, so we've got the drone footage of the survey team tampering with the property markers, Carla said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Now we just need to make sure it gets in the right hands. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. I'll take it to the police, see if they can use it to build a case against the HOA. Mark squeezed her hand, his expression reassuring. And I'll make sure the footage gets to the media. If we can get this story out there, it'll force the HOA to come clean. Carla grinned, her smile sharp as a knife. That's the plan. With any luck, we'll have the HOA and their developer buddies running for the hills by the end of the day. As they parted ways, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. What if the HOA discovered their plan? They had already shown themselves to be ruthless and unscrupulous, who knew what they might do to protect their interests. But she quickly pushed those thoughts aside, determined to see this through. They had come too far to back down now. At the police station, Sarah presented the drone footage to the same officer who had taken their initial report. His eyes widened as he watched the survey team tampering with the property markers, a look of grim understanding crossing his face. This is pretty damning evidence, he murmured, his brow furrowed in concentration. I'll make sure our detectives take a close look at this. With any luck, we can get a warrant to search the HOA's offices and uncover the full scope of their operation. Sarah felt a surge of relief. So you believe us then? You think we have a case? The officer nodded, his expression solemn. Based on what you've shown me, I'd say you've got a strong one. This isn't just a simple property dispute. It's a potential conspiracy to defraud homeowners. With a renewed sense of purpose, Sarah thanked the officer and hurried back to her car, where Mark was waiting anxiously. How'd it go? He asked, his eyes searching her face. Good, Sarah replied, a grin spreading across her face. The cops are taking this seriously. They're going to investigate the HOA and that survey team. Mark let out a sigh of relief, pulling her into a tight embrace. That's great news. And the media. You got the footage to them? Sarah asked. Mark nodded. Yeah, they said they're gonna run a big expose tonight. Hopefully, it'll be enough to bring the whole thing crashing down. As they drove home, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. After weeks of fighting an uphill battle, it finally seemed like the tide was turning in their favor. But deep down, she knew the HOA wouldn't go down without a fight. Whatever happened next, she was determined to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The air was thick with tension as Sarah and Mark watched the local news broadcast, their eyes glued to the screen. The reporter's voice echoed through the living room, delivering a scathing expose on the HOA's underhanded tactics. Homeowners Sarah and Mark have uncovered a shocking scheme involving their local homeowners association and a shady survey team. Exclusive drone footage shows the survey team tampering with property markers, seemingly in an effort to redraw the boundaries and seize land from unsuspecting residents. Sarah gripped Mark's hand as the report continued, detailing the HOA's suspected collusion with a group of real estate developers. The police investigation, the reporter explained, had uncovered a web of fraud and abuse of power that stretched far beyond their small community. As the segment drew to a close, the camera panned to the HOA office, where a visibly shaken Gregory stood before a throng of reporters, fumbling for words. We had no knowledge of any wrongdoing, he stammered, his face flushed with panic. The survey was conducted by an independent firm, and we were simply following the results. The reporter's voice cut in, sharp and unforgiving. Yet our investigation has revealed that the so-called independent survey team has ties to a local real estate development company, casting serious doubt on the validity of their findings. Residents like Sarah and Mark are now fighting to reclaim their property and hold the HOA accountable for their actions. Sarah felt a surge of triumph as the report ended, the weight of the past few weeks lifting from her shoulders. They had done it. They had exposed the HOA's dirty secrets and brought their scheme crashing down. Can you believe it? She whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. We actually won. Mark pulled her into a tight embrace, his own eyes shining with relief and pride. I never doubted we would. You were right to keep fighting, no matter what they threw at us. As they held each other, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the journey they had taken. It had been a battle of wills, a test of their resolve and their faith in the system. But in the end, they had emerged victorious, their American dream still intact. In the days that followed, the fallout from the expose was swift and decisive. The HOA president and the survey team were both arrested on charges of fraud and conspiracy, their shady dealings laid bare for all to see. The developers who had been working with them quickly distanced themselves, their own reputations now tarnished. And as for Sarah and Mark, they reclaimed their rightful property, the fence that had been the source of so much turmoil, now standing as a symbol of their hard-won victory. It was a bittersweet triumph, to be sure, but one that filled them with a sense of renewed purpose and determination. They had fought for their home, their community, and their very way of life. And in the end, they had prevailed. It was a lesson in the power of perseverance, and a reminder that even the mightiest of foes can be brought down when the truth is on your side.